Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the regular council meeting of the Township of Cavan-Monaghan Council on this Tuesday, February 21st, 2023 at 1 p.m. We'll call the meeting to order today. And first, we'll start with our land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that the Township of Cavan-Monaghan is located on the Treaty 20 Mississauga territory in the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe people. We offer our gratitude to First Nations for their care for and teachings about these lands. May we honor these teachings. We'll look to council now for approval of the agenda before us today. Councillor Byrne, seconded by Councillor Natchoff. All in favor? That is approved. Looking for a disclosure of pecuniary interest at this time. Seeing none, there is no closed session, and we'll move right into number 6.1, a presentation from Ms. Carrie Snowdy, Manager of Waste Management with the County of Peterborough. Welcome, Carrie.
Hi, thank you very much for having me today, and thanks for pulling my presentation up. As Mayor Graham mentioned, I'm Carrie. I'm the Manager of Waste Management at Peterborough County, and I'm here to present to you an update on the Blue Box transition to producer responsibility and the implications that will have on Cavan-Monaghan and upcoming decisions that you'll have the opportunity to make because of this transition. Next slide. So what is producer responsibility? It's a regulatory approach to waste management that makes producers of products and packaging responsible for the waste that's generated for them. And in Ontario, the Blue Box program is transitioning from the current model, which is shared industry funding, to one of producer responsibility. Next slide. On the left-hand side, you can see the current model. So producers create products, residents consume them, they put them in their Blue Box, and then the local governments operate the Blue Box program. They receive about 50% funding from the producers, and 50% is offset by taxpayers. So that's where that shared industry funding idea comes from. And then on the right-hand side will be the future model that kind of takes the local government out of the picture. Producers will be taking over a collection of the Blue Box and responsible for paying for all the costs to do so. Next slide. There's a couple pieces of relevant legislation that are pushing this change forward that are important to talk about. Next slide. The first is the older legislation, the Environmental Protection Act and Ontario Regulation 10194. So this has been in place for a long time. This legislation requires municipalities to have Blue Box programs. So we're legislated to do so under the older legislation, which will be winding up because of the new legislation that's been passed by the province. Next slide. And the new legislation is the Waste Free Ontario Act. Part of that is the Waste Diversion Transition Act and the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. So this was passed in 2016 by the province. Essentially, the goal of this is to move towards more of a circular economy. It makes producers responsible for the products that they put into the marketplace in Ontario. Several programs in Ontario have already transitioned to producer responsibility. So that would be batteries, electronics, hazardous waste, tires, and now the largest program, the Blue Box, is transitioning. There was a regulation passed under this legislation in 2021, and that has all of the specific details on what producers are required to do and targets that they have to meet under the regulation. Next slide. So how the program currently works in the townships in Peterborough County is that Peterborough County administers the Blue Box program on behalf of the townships. We hold a contract with Emterra, who does curbside collection, depot or transfer station collection and processing of the Blue Box material. The county submits a report every year to the Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority, which is the province essentially, and that's how we receive 50% of the funding back. And the county supplies the front end bins at the township depots for the Blue Box collection. Next slide. So under this new program, there are eligible sources and non-eligible sources. Eligible sources are the types of properties that producers are required to collect from. So these would be residences, single-family houses, seasonal homes, facilities, which are not-for-profit, long-term care homes, retirement homes, schools, and multi-residential buildings, and then public spaces. There are non-eligible sources that the producers don't have to collect from under this legislation that I'll talk about at the end of the presentation. Next slide. So there will be a transition period that starts this year in July. to the end of December of 2025. And during this 2.5-year period, every municipality and First Nation community in the province will transition to producer responsibility. Every community has been given a transition date, and all the townships in Peterborough County transition January 1st, 2024. Municipalities can choose to negotiate with the pros or producers to continue service delivery or fully divest their responsibility. And County of Peterborough Council has chosen to divest on January 1st, 2024. Then there will be a post-transition period, January 1st, 2026 and afterwards. So at this point, producers will be responsible for all aspects of the Blue Box program. So communications, replacing blue boxes, collection, dealing with complaints, all aspects. And next slide. So again, all townships have been given the transition date of January 1st, 2024. Next slide. So what will be included in this new Blue Box program as far as what will be recyclable? Up until the end of transition, the producers are required to maintain what municipalities currently have been operating. So from now until the end of 2025, nothing will change for Cavan Monaghan or anywhere in Peterborough County as far as what's recyclable and what isn't. And then starting January 1st, 2026, there's a new list of items that producers have to collect under the new regulation. Next slide. So on the left, this is just a typical example of products that are currently being collected in municipal programs, but it's different in every municipality. Whereas on the right-hand side, this is what producers will have to collect in the new program starting in 2026. So it's a little bit confusing the way it's worded in the regulation, but essentially everything that we're collecting now will still be recyclable, plus there will be new items added. So things like single-use products like plates and cutlery and straws and things like that. Styrofoam will be added that we're not currently collecting. Next slide. And so this just shows an example of that. So right now, every municipality, their Blue Box program is different. In this new program, there will be one consistent list across the entire province. Next slide. And it's also important to note the difference between producers and producer responsibility organizations. So producers are the brand holders, importers of products. They're any company that sells these products into Ontario. So this would include grocery store foods with packaging, retail store items with packaging, and fast food packaging. A producer responsibility organization is a company that producers sign on with, and they represent the producers, and they essentially operate the program on behalf of the producers, and they help them meet their requirements and responsibilities. So each producer decides which pro they want to join. Next slide. And this is a further demonstration of that. So you can see examples of producers on the left. They're big companies we've all heard of. And this would be an example of a producer responsibility organization or pro on the right, Circular Materials. So all these producers have signed on with Circular Materials, and they will run the program. Next slide. So Circular Materials is actually the largest pro in Ontario. They have over 60%, I think, of producers signed on with them. So they are overall responsible for the common collection system. So they will procure and award agreements for collection of the Blue Box program. They've hired a company called Reverse Logistics Group to help arrange their agreements. And municipalities have to share critical details about our programs before the transition to make sure it's a smooth handover. Next slide. And so this just shows that what Circular Materials will be doing is overseeing the common collection system. They will make sure there's curbside and depot collection. They'll determine the location of the receiving facilities where the material gets consolidated, and also where the recycling facilities will be. Next slide. So given the extensive scope of work and limited timeline, they're trying to do all of this in a really short time frame to transition over. CMO presented, or Circular Materials, or CMO, presented a standard offer revised last September to all municipalities in Ontario, requesting they provide interim Blue Box services during their transition period. So this would mean that, for example, the county would continue to operate our contract with Emterra during the transition period as a contractor to SEMO, and they would provide us payments. Next slide. So municipalities had two options. They can opt in or opt out. If they opt in, they sign agreements with commercial terms set by SEMO and they become a contractor to SEMO. If they opt out, SEMO will secure arrangements with an alternative service provider and just work directly with them rather than the municipality. Next slide. So communities can consider providing whatever services they want to continue with. However, Peterborough County Council decided to opt out of all services. So there's a link to the council report there from last December. And so based on this decision, there is an opportunity for townships to contract with SEMO for depot operations, if you would like to allow SEMO to use township depots to meet their legislative requirements, and townships will be compensated for this service. Next slide. So since Peterborough County's opted out of all services, SEMO has approached our contractor Emterra to offer them an agreement to continue curbside collection and depot collection in all townships. But SEMO is required by the legislation to collect blue box material from the same number of depots that are currently being used in each township during the transition period. So in order to meet their requirements, they're offering contracts with townships for depot operations to allow them to continue to use your depots. Next slide. So you also have two choices, opt in or opt out. So if you sign a contract with SEMO for depot operation, there are pros and cons. Some pros would be that blue box services will remain at the current depot. Townships will receive payments from SEMO for blue box operations. Some cons would be you would have to agree to SEMO's contract terms. We still haven't seen the contract that they are offering, but I'll get into that a little bit later as well. And payments will be standardized for all townships. So SEMO is coming up with a standard payment model that they'll be providing to each township. It's not going to be based on actual operation costs or invoices for operating your depots. If you decide to opt out, some pros to that would be that you would no longer have any responsibility for a blue box program. You wouldn't have to follow SEMO's contract terms. There may be additional space at your transfer station to use for other diversion programs. Some cons would be SEMO would have to open up a separate location in Cavan Monaghan where residents could drop off blue box material. So that would probably be more inconvenient for residents because they would have to take their blue box material somewhere else, and townships wouldn't receive payments. And then something specific to Cavan Monaghan to consider as well is that they're only required to operate the same number of depots during the transition period. So just for that 2-year period until 2026. They are required to operate depots in areas that don't provide curbside collection to 100% of residents. But because Cavan Monaghan does, they would have the option not to continue providing service at that depot in 2026. Next slide. So as far as next steps, SEMO has scheduled a meeting with each township with staff for Cavan Monaghan. That meeting is, I believe, on Friday, March 3rd, to start discussions on what they're offering to townships. County staff will also be present at the first meeting to help assist. SEMO is working on a contract document to provide to townships to review and decide whether you'd like to sign on or not. We've asked that that contract document be provided prior to the first meeting, so staff would have time to actually review that. And then they will also be putting together a payment model, which we've also asked that they provide that prior to that first meeting. As far as site infrastructure, the county currently owns the bins at the depot, but there's an option for us to either transfer ownership over to the contractor, Emterra, or to Cavan Monaghan, whatever works best. And then once townships have met with SEMO and reviewed the offers, township councils can determine whether you'd like to opt in or out, and county staff are here to assist wherever possible. Next slide. And the last thing I just wanted to touch on is non-eligible sources. So these are the locations that producers are not required to collect from under the legislation. So any of these properties on the right-hand side. So any industrial or commercial property, any municipal building, school, place of worship, things like that. So they have producers, or CMO has said that they will allow this material to be mixed in during the transition period and collected along residential routes with other eligible sources. But starting in 2026, it has to be separated and they don't want it anymore. Even during the transition period, we would have to pay for that material because it's not covered under the regulation. So the county's contractor currently collects from about 600 of these properties curbside. About 70 of them are in Cavan Monaghan. So county staff are currently working on options to present to county council on whether the county continues to provide service to these locations starting in 2024 and how we might fund this program. Next slide. So I'm not going to get into too much detail, but there's essentially three options. So the first option would be that the county continues to collect and the program would be paid for by the residential and commercial tax levies. This is how the program's currently funded, but this would mean that residents would be subsidizing the costs for those commercial locations. Next slide. Option two would be the county continues to collect and we would fund it from the commercial tax levy only. So only commercial properties would be paying for this service. Next slide. And then option number three would be that we stop collecting from these locations and they would be responsible for their own private collection costs. Next slide. So county staff are going to be surveying non-eligible sources. We have a list of all the locations we collect from. So just to get their feedback, as well as make them aware that this change is coming. So if we send out the survey and you do receive any questions or anything like that, feel free to pass those over to county staff to help answer those. And we'll make sure that Cavan Monaghan staff are informed when that goes out. Next slide. And then as far as the non-eligible sources at the depots, so these locations are currently able to use depots to drop off food box materials. So during the transition period, it's okay if that is mixed in. If you decide to continue to collect, CMO will assume that 25% of the material is from non-eligible sources unless we can prove otherwise. So they've provided a guidance document to municipalities to be able to show that it's less than 25%, which is, I think, definitely the case. So there's a couple different methods. One that a couple townships have tried so far is using MPAC data, which doesn't take a lot of staff time. And we've seen really good results from that, like anywhere from 2 to 4%. So it's much smaller. And so basically that determines what percentage of payments that they'll be taking off because you're required to pay for that material. Next slide. So just to give a summary and next steps, all townships transition January 1st, 2024. The county's opted out of providing all blue box services. CMO will be required to provide a contractor for curbside collection and collection at depots. We think this will be the same contractor, Mterra, that we're working with right now, but agreements haven't been signed yet. CMO is interested in working with the townships for depot operations so they can meet their legislative requirements. CMO has set up a meeting with each township to start discussing this. CMO will provide the townships with the contract documents and payment model prior to the first meeting. We hope. We've been requesting that. Township councils can determine whether the townships would like to opt in or opt out. And the county will continue to work with townships on non-eligible source options at depots, send out the surveys, and then bring that to county council to decide what we're going to do for curbside in particular for non-eligible sources. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thanks very much, Carrie. Questions, members of council? Councilor Byrne.
I have a few, but I'll start off. What do you define a commercial farm as?
A commercial farm? Is that what you said? Oh, okay. Through Mayor Graham. It's been a little bit unclear as far as what's defined under this regulation as commercial and not commercial. So I couldn't give you 100% an answer off the top of my head.
Other questions? Deputy Mayor Huntley?
Through you, Chair. Thanks for the presentation, Terry. Appreciate it. A lot of clear, crisp information in there, but the one part that I'm still a little fuzzy on is if the transition date is January 1st, 2024, but the pilot then runs for another 2 years, or not pilot, I'm sorry, the transition period then runs for another 2 years. So from January 2024 to January 2026, do residents really need to do anything differently, or is it all the same day to day for them?
Through the mayor, that's the whole idea behind the transition period, is that it should be a very smooth transition for residents and they won't notice a change. I think the biggest change will be if they have an issue or their blue box isn't collected, it will be a different contact that they'll need to reach out to. So it's likely that CMO will require whoever they're contracting with to deal with resident calls and issues. So it would likely be MTerra. So the county is planning to put out communications throughout this year to make sure that residents know that that change is coming. We know we're still going to be getting calls for quite a while, I think, but that would probably be the only change residents would see throughout that transition period. Starting in 2026, that's when we'll see more things change because there'll be a different list of items, as I mentioned. Also, the producers will be able to change what type of bins they want to use. They could change it potentially from 2-stream collection to single stream collection if they wanted. So they have a lot of different options that they could change the program into at that point.
Other questions, members of council? Councilor Byrne?
Through the chair, right now you're saying that some of the producers are paying some of the cost and it's gonna go to 100%. And it mentions something about online there. So you're telling me today that Amazon's been kicking in for this kind of stuff forever? Like, how are you gonna deal with this online, and how are you even gonna deal with all the other producers that don't get covered under this CMO?
Through the mayor, so all producers, regardless of whether they sign with CMO or another producer responsibility organization, they've all already registered. They've been contacted by the province who will have to oversee the compliance towards that. And they've had to provide reporting as far as what they supply into the Ontario marketplace and things like that. And so that's all done through the province as far as determining what payments they have to make into the system. We may see that it's a possibility that the producers may offset some of those costs onto the consumers. So we've heard about possible container recycling fees and things like that that could be placed on products when people buy them in the grocery store and things like that. So that is a concern, that people, rather than paying for it in their tax bill, they may have to pay for it when they shop at the grocery store or something like that.
To me, that was pretty much a given. The producers are not gonna do it for free. I don't know, is there any cost analysis to say, for me as a consumer, if I have to pay property tax or I have to go through this process, how much it's gonna impact me, negative or positive?
Through the mayor, I think for the most part, it will be a positive thing for residents, because I think that it would likely be more significant what they're paying through their taxes for a collection program, unless they're buying a lot of products at the grocery store. I think that they were saying that the potential recycling fee for beverage containers could be anywhere from 1 to 3 cents, something like that, per purchase. So hopefully that it will be a positive for taxpayers.
Other questions? Councilor Nacho?
Thank you, through you, Chair. Can you just speak briefly as to why Peterborough County chose to opt out?
Through the mayor, there were a number of reasons. The biggest reason is that the way that the agreement was put in place for Peterborough County, we would have had to continue our contract with Emterra and pay them their costs while receiving payments from SEMO. However, the payments from SEMO were not based on our actual costs. They were based on our 2020 costs with a few CPI and fuel adjustments built in. However, when you did the cost analysis, it did not cover all of our costs. It would have been a significant cost to taxpayers still to do it that way. Whereas if the county opted out, which they did, the county won't be required to pay for any services. So that will be a savings on taxpayers. And because the county held the contract for curbside collection and depot collection, SEMO has said that they will take over that if the townships do decide they want to sign on for their depots. So the townships are actually put in a better position because SEMO has not offered this to really any other municipalities. It was just because of the very specific circumstance between the county and the townships in our municipality that it worked out that way. It's a little confusing, but a couple of the other reasons that the county didn't opt in was we also didn't know the location of the receiving facility where the recycling material would go. So it could be anywhere within an hour of the center of each township. So if it wasn't the Peterborough facility where the material is going right now, it would have cost us, I think, over $1 million a year to put extra vehicles on the road and transport that somewhere else. So it really came down to a cost perspective.
Councilor Byrne?
Through the chair, you also mentioned in there at one point, the people that opted out would be compensated. By who and how is that going to work?
Through the mayor, so the townships would be compensated if you opt in. So SEMO is putting together a payment model that they would pay townships based on allowing them to use your depots for blue box collection, essentially. So the bins would be at the depots. SEMO would have a contractor, likely Emterra or another contractor that would collect the material from the depots. They would be responsible for that. They would just be paying the township to have that available at the depot and operate the depot and accept that material from residents.
Yeah, I can speak to briefly a bit about some of the county discussion. Carrie's already done a lot of it, but there's a lot of unknowns from how this is going to be done and how various, whether it was the county or the townships, were going to be compensated based on, and I think, and Carrie, my question is going to be after this would be, at the time of the county consideration, I don't think any municipality had signed on with SEMO in their initial draft of the contract because it was going to, in essence, create a scenario where we were still on the hook for 30 to 40% of the cost of processing under the initial agreement. So the understanding was that, well, this is phase one and no municipalities were going for it. Of the 444 at the time, I think 300 had turned it down. So there wasn't a lot of uptake with this initial draft because of a lot of the things that Carrie's presentation outlined. Gaps in service, changes in contamination rate that were unreasonable from a standpoint. But maybe I'll let you answer that question in there as well. And if there's anything else you want to speak to it.
Sure, through you. Yeah, so at the time when we brought that report, there had been no contract signed. You're correct. There have been some municipalities that have signed on now because we are in 2023 and the program is starting. So, for example, City of Toronto has signed on. We haven't actually seen what kind of agreement they've been able to get from SEMO. But because their program is so complicated, I think that it was more ideal for them to sign on. The majority of municipalities who transition in 2023 have opted out and have not decided to continue. Again, I think the county of Peterborough and the townships, the way that the waste management program is divided in our municipality is very unique. And so that's why this agreement that they're offering to our townships is different than what they're providing elsewhere. So in any other situation, it's typically depot communities where they have their own contract for collection. And so they would be required to still have that contract and pay those costs. So in this situation, if you decided to sign on with SEMO, you wouldn't have to pay any costs to any contractor. It would just be SEMO providing you with payments essentially for them to use your depot.
Thanks, Carrie. Other questions? Deputy Mayor Huntley?
Through you, Chair. I don't know whether you have a full answer for this one yet, but it's with regard with the non-eligible sources. Like if it almost sounds like it goes to, it become like a commercial business out there to collect from the non-eligible. And the question is do you expect there to be legislation down into municipal governments to be responsible for that, or will it be just a free market once this opens up? Thank you.
Through the mayor, the province has said that they will be coming out with some sort of legislation for the commercial sector that may require producers to be responsible for that as well. But it was not included in this original producer responsibility legislation. So for now, it's up to municipalities as to whether they want to continue to provide that service or if they want to just leave it up to those individual commercial locations to be responsible for those costs. It's hard to say what it might look like either way because this is all new and it's just happening now. I know some municipalities have decided that they're just going to leave these locations on their own. And there's been a lot of backlash, as you can imagine, frustrated people who have small businesses that don't want to pay for those costs. So it's something that we're working on right now.
Councilor Byrne, and then Councilor Nacho.
Through you, Chair. If I've got this right, the CMO is just a private run company that the government of Ontario is going to legislate to be in control of everything. At what point, when people start to wake up and realize it's not working, what's the option to get back to something that might?
Through the mayor, so SEMO is a not-for-profit organization. The requirement is not on them. The requirement's on the producers. So there is a compliance organization through the province called RIPRA, Resource Recovery Productivity Authority. And so they would be responsible for making sure producers are actually meeting their requirements. There's high recycling targets in the regulation. So that is a positive aspect of the regulation that will push producers to have to collect more material than they're currently collecting. So that may be a positive as far as making sure that they're meeting their requirements. But we have to see how well the province enforces that. And there is, AMO is a really good organization that provides a lot of advocacy. So I know that it's something they're looking closely at as well. And likely they'll be hearing from municipalities who are frustrated once this program starts if it's not going well.
Through you, Chair. MPACT is a non-for-profit organization too that costs me, the taxpayer, a huge amount of money in a given calendar year. The not-for-profit doesn't mean it doesn't come with a big expense.
Councilor Nacho.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. Is this a completely new and organic program, or is there an example anywhere in the world where this model has been taken from? And if so, can you speak a little bit to where that is and why they've taken that model and how it's been effective?
Through the mayor, it's not a new program. So many locations in Europe have programs like this, as well as on Canada. So British Columbia was the first province in Canada to transition to producer responsibility, and a number of other provinces are currently going through this process as well. So I think it's something that you'll see across Canada in the very near future. The Ontario program was based, I think, a little bit of a mix of the BC program and European program. So it's a little bit of mishmash of everything as far as what the province thought would work based on programs that have been put in place.
Thanks, Carrie. Other questions? Councilor Byrne.
Through you, Chair. At the present, right now, Mterra, when they process all the blue box program that they're currently running in the county, the profits they make off that material, where does that end up? Does that end up on their side of the equation or on counties?
The county does receive revenue from the sale of that material. It's a mix as far as who profits. Mterra would be making some profits off of that as well. But the nice thing about the producer responsibility aspect is that markets are going down. So in previous years, those profits were higher than our cost to process the material. It's getting to the point now where we're paying more to process the material than the revenue that we're receiving. So because the markets go up and down all the time, it's a little bit, we're at risk as far as whether we're benefiting from that or we're paying more for the processing of the material.
Other questions? Seeing none. Thanks very much, Ms. Snoddy. We need a motion to receive the presentation. Councillor Byrne and Deputy Mayor Hunley, all in favor? That is approved. Thanks very much for all that information. Very much enjoyed it. All right, moving on. We have 3 sets of minutes before us, and I believe the clerk has told me correctly that we can approve all of them as presented. So looking for a mover for those minutes, Councillor Byrne and Councillor Natchop, all in favor? That is approved. We are now at the reports section of the meeting. I believe we have Bill 23, changes to development charges update. Ms. Pope.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor, to Council. I have this update from Bill 23 on the changes to the development charges. I just want to provide a quick summary overview in my report. We can definitely come back to and speak to it afterwards, but we do have our consultant on the line that can speak to the full detailed memo that's attached. And I would like to give Daryl Abbs that opportunity because he does have to leave by 2 o'clock, and whereas you have availability to access anything you need from me today. So I'll just quickly, just in the report, the primary thing I want to highlight is where, if you go down on the page there slightly, where it says the township may lose DC revenues of up to 250,000 annually or up to 1.3 million over a 5-year period. Again, this depends on growth and development. And I'd like to explain just a little bit further on page 2. If we can go to the bottom where it has the table of the percentages for all DCs, just right there. Yep, a little bit further down. Thank you. So for all DCs that were passed after January 1st, 2022, so ours was actually passed effective August 3rd, 2022. So therefore we qualify in that category. Year 1, we were allowed to charge 80% of our rates. Normally we're able to charge 100% of our rates. So that was backdated to November 28th, and we have to process any credits for that additional 20% that we charged before this legislation was put in effect, and we were told to go back to November 28th. And then annually thereafter, we're allowed to increment by 5%. So in 2023, on August 3rd, we're allowed to go up to 85%, another up to 90%, 2024. On the next page, you'll see we go to 95%, and year 5 is expiring. So depending on which year and with the growth is occurring would depend on which schedule we're sitting at and what we're charging. So that's the reason why we can't identify exactly. However, that is an estimate. So that's just a preliminary overview. I definitely go through the report in more detail with you, but I would like to turn it over to Daryl Abbs. And if we could pull up the attachment, which is the memo that was drafted for our municipality by Watson and Associates with details of the changes.
Just give staff a second here. Daryl, is Daryl with us? Can he just do a volume check, Daryl?
Hi, Council. How are you?
Very good. Thank you very much for joining us today, Daryl. We'll turn it over to you. I know you're pressed for time, so we'll let you get to it.
Not a problem. Thank you for having me before you, Council. I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions that you may have. Perhaps we can pull up the memo and go to the, I guess, second to last page, page 9. And I'll just kind of briefly provide an overview of the changes, and then we can talk about our estimated financial impact from these changes. Now, I will note that with all of this, it's an estimate based on based on the information we have today and based on the anticipated growth. And if the development takes a little bit longer or proceeds a little faster, it will have an impact on what the true financial impact is going to be. However, I know and understand that staff will be monitoring the development and the reductions in the DC revenue as a result of these changes. So I'll just briefly kind of provide an overview of each of the changes, briefly touch on what the potential revenue loss is through development charges, and then obviously the timing of these, because not all of the changes have taken effect immediately. So we'll start with the immediate impacts, the changes that have taken effect. There's the additional residential exemption. And so under the previous rules, single detached homes were allowed to add up to 2 apartment units, either in the house or one in the house, one and on top of a garage or in a garden suite, and they didn't have to pay a DC. What the province has done is now expand that to single family homes, townhomes, and row homes. And so each of those type of units can have 2 extra apartments as of right, and they don't have to pay a development charge. So if we look at based on historical trends and building permits with respect to these types of units, there's the potential revenue loss to be anywhere from 0 to about $57,000 in DC revenues for a total of almost $300,000 over a 5-year period. The province has also removed housing as an eligible DC service, but as I understand, the county did not include housing as a service, so there's no impact with respect to that change. Nonprofit housing previously used, they were able to pay their development charge in installments over a 20-year period. What the province has done is just come in and say, no, all nonprofit housing is exempt. And so with the anticipated financial impact there, we didn't see any in the application process specific for nonprofit housing. So there wouldn't be any anticipated financial impact in the next few years. The mandatory phase-in is probably the biggest impact as the township did pass their DC bylaw after the date with which the province said everyone has to impose this phase in. And so if we, as Ms. Pope provided, the phase in starts in year 1 and then all the way up to year 5 is when you can impose 100%. And then after year 5 onwards, you can impose the full charge all the way to year 10. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But if we take a look at the anticipated development and we apply that phase in, netting off the exemptions already provided, it'd be approximately $200,000 a year or $1 million over 5 years. And that really is dependent on the timing of the development. So if you have development, because we are heading into a kind of cooler period and it does trend to happen a little bit later in the phase in, that would lessen the impact of the reductions. But overall, if we take into account the existing exemptions, it'd be a reduction of almost 5% of the anticipated DC revenues over that 5-year period. There's also exemptions for or discounts for rental housing based on the number of bedrooms. And, in review of the applications in the process, there may be some rental housing that might meet the requirements, but it's unclear at this time if those applications or those developments will meet the requirements to get the discount. And so, we've identified no anticipated financial impact in the immediate term. The maximum interest rate provisions, they've now set a cap on this maximum interest rate. So for developments that would pay in installment payments or had their rate frozen, they were subject to an interest rate on those payments. And so there was no cap previously, and then some municipalities may have taken the interests to a rate that was undesirable. So the province has stepped in and put a maximum cap on that. But there's no anticipated financial impact on that, as there are currently no installment payments being provided. And then there's the requirement to allocate at least 60% of the revenue in the or 60% of the starting balance of the reserve fund for water, wastewater, and roads. But that's really an administrative issue and not a direct financial impact to the township. So that's all the changes that have taken place immediately. And if we go down to the next table, there's a couple changes that will not impact you immediately, but they will either in the future due to regulatory changes or upon updating your DC bylaw. So in this category, these aren't immediate impacts, but they will be potentially in the future. So the historical level of service calculations that are set out in Appendix B to the background study. Previously, we had to look out over the historical 10-year period to calculate what our maximum DC eligible cap is. As part of the changes to the legislation, they've now extended this to 15 years. So what we've done is we've gone back and we've looked at the previous study and we said, okay, well, what if we had to go back 15 years? What would that have done to our calculations? And it would have reduced our DC recoverable by about $8,400 annually, or about $42,000 over a 5-year period. Now that doesn't take effect now, but when you update the DC bylaw or you pass a new DC bylaw, that will have to be taken into consideration. For the definition of capital costs, Bill 23 has removed studies as an eligible cost. So that means the category of services or class of service called growth studies will be removed when you update or undertake a new DC bylaw. So right now in that capital worksheet, you'll see about $365,000 in DC eligible amounts. Depending on what the amount of studies will be in the future, that's no longer recoverable once you update your DC bylaw. You can continue to collect for studies and fund growth related studies up until you pass a new bylaw. And then for the DC bylaw expiry, previously the Act said that bylaws can last no longer than 5 years. That's now been extended to 10 years. But since your bylaw includes an expiry date, it would still expire within the 5-year period. And then the last two items here, just said in the future, because it's unclear. These ones will require regulatory updates to the regulations. And that's the new mandatory exemptions for affordable and attainable housing. And so as these are generally defined in the legislation as no more than 80% of the market value or the market rent is the definition of affordable, and attainable doesn't have a definition yet. The market rent for which the 80% would apply and the definition of attainable will be set out in the regulations at a future date. And then additionally, there was a revision to allow the capital cost definition to be refined such that land cannot be included for certain services. However, no services have been prescribed as of yet. And I believe that's the end of the changes. And so I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have on any of this. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Daryl. Kimberly, we're going to go to questions for Daryl now. Is that all right? And then we'll circle back. Very good. Deputy Mayor Huntley.
Through you, Chair, to Daryl, I guess. Is there a requirement to record the difference in the development charges? So if you're not obtaining, like if anything below the 85%, like I've heard multiple occasions where the government will or the province will keep us whole. So does that mean we have to keep track of the variance? I guess your numbers are projected. We already have DC numbers that we have projected, but now we're faced with the reality of what's going to actually happen. And is there a reporting requirement for keeping a track of that delta? Thank you.
Thank you. Through the mayor. There's no requirement to report. However, I understand that staff will be tracking this. There have been some indications from the ministry that municipalities will be made whole. However, it's unclear what that means. There's been various considerations mentioned, but there's been no definitive or guarantee of, providing funds directly to municipalities based on the revenue loss. So that's unclear at this moment, but I think it is in your best interest to track that. So you do have the ability to let the province know how much money you have lost from these changes.
Other questions, members of council? Councilor Byrne?
Through you, Chair, I don't know, do you have any insight or best guess at what attainable is gonna have a definition pinned to it? Because the definition of affordable doesn't work very well for most citizens on a 40-hour work week making minimum wage.
Yeah, through the mayor, unfortunately, no, is the shortest answer. They've just stated that they will provide the definition through the regulations, and it's unclear at this point. Multiple municipalities have various definitions of attainable, but I'm not, it's unclear if they would actually use one of those definitions. Generally, municipalities have different ways of approaching affordable housing definitions. Usually it's tied to income in some form. But this legislation provides for the affordable to be tied to the market value. And so we're waiting for the regulations to understand what this new housing bulletin is what the ministry is going to release, and it's going to provide what the market value is so that you can easily take 80% of that. But it's unclear if they're going to keep that, let's say, at a county level. Are they going to bring it down to the municipal level? But even within the municipality, there could be variations in the market value from one area to another. So there's so many outstanding questions on these issues, but we'll definitely continue to follow up and let the township know as soon as we find out.
Thanks for that, Daryl. I have two questions. One's just a clarification. Because you mentioned with us having that updated bylaw as of August, just for clarity, with regards to the studies, the growth-related studies recognized in that update, we are still able to collect DCs for those pre-identified subjects, even though they're after that specified deadline, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And are we able to, is that at an 80% or is that at the full regarded growth portion?
All of the charges imposed for the first year are at 80%. So even for the growth related studies, the charge would be 80% of the full calculated charge.
So there's still a 20% and then a staggered reduction in the amount that we can accumulate for those. Okay, thank you. That was one question. And maybe the second one is more maybe for Kimberly. In the report, I think there's a regular highlight of the additional administrative burden on municipalities for monitoring, tracking, and enforcing a number of components of these changes. And I was thinking that it might be prudent to track those additional costs, whether it's an hourly rate or things of that nature, when we're continuing to monitor the lost revenue. The other side of that coin is the additional administrative burden, which is still a cost to the municipality that's a byproduct of these. So I didn't know, Ms. Pope, if there's a conscious engagement to do that as well in how we're moving forward, just so that the true impacts are understood. And again, thanks for clarifying that. I think we're all sort of waiting to understand what these definitions of this legislation are going to mean, and that's why all of the various reports we've seen at the county and at the township are all kind of speculative until you actually know exactly what's going to fit into these boxes. But to you, Ms. Pope.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor, to Council. We do have a preliminary plan in place. So if you can imagine, since November, we were charging 100% of our rates. Now we have to go back. So basically, there's a 20% discount that's going to be applied. Although the number of applications that came in wasn't necessarily significant during that period of time, we still have to do that. So we have the full rate and then we have the discount, and we're going to be tracking it that way. Just for your information, historically, once we set a bylaw for 5 years, we have rates that really only change January 1st annually when the cost indices are applied. Now, because we have this ad hoc August date, we now have two. So I've already had preliminary discussions with the director and with our CBO about how that's going to implicate their pamphlets, online communications, because that rate will change. That rate is going to be different every January 1st when the indexing comes in. And then again, August 3rd, we're going to have that 5% potential increase. So that is an administrative burden that has come on to us as well. We're very fortunate that we've moved towards some new electronic opportunities over the last number of years, moving in finance to Diamond and then Cloud Permit. And so we're hoping for integration to try to improve that process. But you are absolutely correct. There is an administrative burden here to track this over the period of time. I just want to make another point, and maybe Daryl, you can chime into this as well. But right now, the growth studies are allowed because they're in a bylaw that existed prior to. And like you said and confirmed that it will be in place for the 5 years. But if we were to open back up and pass a new bylaw, that at that moment, if we did it before the 5-year term for us, which is 2027, it would then cause our growth studies to be ineligible. And so we'd want to consider that if there were any conversations like that in the future. I'm not sure if our CBO would like to make comment on administration, or you're okay? Okay, so we're in agreement on what I said. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pope. Any other questions, members of the council? Seeing none. Very good. Thanks very much for joining us today, Daryl and Ms. Pope. Thank you for those comments. Look for a motion to receive the report and accept the recommendations. Councillor Natchoff, seconded by Councillor Edgerton. All in favor? That is approved. Thanks very much, everyone. Moving on, the next report before us is the finance report. Ms. Pope, the final draft of the 2023 operating and capital budget.
Thank you, Mayor, through you to all of council. This is the final accumulation of all the hard work that starts back in September every year from all staff members, management team, budget committee, and of course, all of council. This particular draft provides you with all the changes as discussed at the last meetings, all the motions therein, and any updates to actual to budget have also been included in your package so that you can see that. So before you today is the final draft for council to approve, and we can move forward then with our 2023 budget. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ms. Pope. Thanks to everyone in all departments for all their hard work. Obviously, we started at a much, a significant tax increase and burden for the ratepayers that wasn't going to be digestible, but there's been a lot of work and we made a lot of ground and even put away a significant amount of money for projects next year that we weren't ready to move forward with this year. So kudos to everyone for all of that work and that process. It's no short order, especially with the new council. So thanks for all the hard work and dedication to that. The recommendations are in the budget before us in the report. So we're looking for a mover and a seconder for those recommendations. Councillor Byrne, okay, we can, is it with regards to a motion or is it separate? Okay, sure. Go ahead, Councillor Byrne.
Through you, Chair, if we move on this motion, do we still get to discuss anything within the budget itself?
So with regards to, is there any, it depends on the context. I mean, what we gave direction at the last meeting to come back with a budget of the final presentation now. Do you have questions about specific departments? Because this is the direction that we gave to come back to for final approval. So if there's something that pertains to an adjustment in the levy, then obviously we couldn't approve it, or, so that's like, it depends on the question, I guess.
And to be honest, I'm really not sure. I was hoping to get some clarity on 4870, which is the environmental part of the documents that were presented today for the final draft. And I want to make sure I understand it. So when I'm talking to people that live in the township and they ask me questions, that I've got a valid answer for them. When I look at that area of environmental, I think we're basically talking about the transfer station over on the 8th line, which is now called Sire Line. If I have it right, we're basically, as a township, the transfer station has generated over $13,700 worth of revenue through the sale of bag tags. And that's on top of the 600 or more residents inside the township that actually use the transfer station to drop off their waste for a variety of good reasons. We've also generated an income of over $20,000 for steel and electronic waste. We've also generated an income of over $32,000 for stuff like construction material, drywall waste, and bulk household items that would be normal to most of the people that live in the township over a course of a lifetime. When I look at the expense side of that same document for 4870, I see that, oh, it's roughly on page 57, sorry. When I look through the expenses for the transfer station, when I do a rough total, the actual amount of revenue that the transfer station generates is pretty close to the amount of expense to run that actual transfer station when the curbside pickup is taken out of it, if I read it right. And curbside pickup is rapidly increasing in cost and expects to double in the next year. The one thing I was worried about or interested in is what impact assesses that 2 or 3 acres of whatever it is down there in the swamp. We're paying roughly $400 or $4,500 worth of property tax for that property. And when I look at the Lions Den, which is on prime real estate over on an area that's going to be rapidly developed because developers own all that area, we're only paying, I think it's a little over $1,500 for property tax. So I'm kind of curious how that gets assessed.
Ms. Pope, would you like to address how the property taxation works?
Through you, Mayor, to council, that's a very good question. So just to touch base first on talking about what pays for what, the $193,870 was the garbage pickup curbside that was included within this budget. All the revenues that you identify help offset the tax rate. So we don't take it as a surplus. There was a motion of council during this budget that if there is ever any surplus, we would put it forward for capital improvements at that location. There hasn't been. And at the time of printing of this report, we know that there is a deficit of $8,000, plus there were additional bills that came in after the fact. So I'm already carrying in the 2023 budget a deficit to recover $9,000. So even with all the revenues, even with the environmental tax rate, we didn't bring in enough to cover it. And it's primarily due to the waste collection program and the hike in fees that report went to council last July or September, pardon me. It went in September. So we were anticipating for the first time, because it was after budget, that we would hit a deficit in the 2023 year. It's not common, but it is what happened. So just as far as something paying for something, I did a little bit of digging because you did bring this question to me, thank you, in advance about the property taxes, so I could have the answer today for you and all of council. So we've looked into this, and if you recall, we have a public utility program with regards to our water, wastewater, because there's certain exemptions where municipalities are exempt on certain facilities, and there's some that are not. And I've received confirmation back from MPAC that I'm just going to read to you from the information here from the Municipal Affairs Act under Public Utility. It has a long list, but I'll just go specifically to this point. A site for the disposal, transfer, reduction, reuse, or recycling of waste or any other works or systems for supplying with general necessities or conveniences that are vested or owned, controlled by municipality or municipalities or local boards, services, and public. So it is one of the ones that we're not allowed to be exempt for. So we have under this particular property, it's considered commercial full. It is not exempt, and it's not because of the public utility requirement under the Municipal Affairs Act, the same process that we have for water, wastewater. And it's secondary to that, remembering that we have 2016 current value assessments, not today's value, 2023, but the 2016 value for that particular piece of property is $210,000 for the entire property. I have had discussions with MPAC about revisiting it because of the facility that's there, just to make sure that we have an appropriate assessment at that particular property. But we don't have that answer back to you yet. And as far as our electronic files exist, I went back that far, and we have consistently been commercial full since prior to 2006. So I can pull data, it's all manual searching prior to 2006. So we are re-looking at just to see if there's any potential exemptions that we can have as far as the type of use on that property, if perhaps it's not at 210 and there's a valuation reduction that can happen, but there won't be a change in the classification and there won't be a change in the realty tax class of commercial. And that's the reason why it is listed there as property taxes. Does that answer the questions? Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Pope. Answers the question? Okay, perfect. Other questions, members of council, before we go for the motion with regards to the 5 recommendations in the report? Seeing none, we'll look for a mover. Councillor Natchoff and Deputy Mayor Huntley, all in favor? That is approved. There you go. Very good. 3-2. Council and committee verbal reports, 8.3. Any members of council with a verbal or committee report? Seeing none. Oh, sorry, Councillor Natchoff, go ahead.
Pardon me, through you. Chair, I had met this week with the Ganaraska Regional Conservation Authority, and predominantly the discussion was just trying to have an understanding of when they feel that they will be able to reopen all of the trails subsequent to the May 2022 windstorm. Other than just reports on maintenance and cleanup, as well as discussing where certain materials are being sold to. They were not able at that time to provide a definitive guideline. Hopes are sometime potentially fall of this year, weather permitted, and I'll report more when I have our next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Natchoff. Seeing no other verbal reports, do we need a motion for that report? So we need a motion to receive that committee report. Deputy Mayor Huntley, Councillor Byrne, all in favor? That is approved. I see no general business, no correspondence for information, no correspondence for action. And then we have no bylaws except for the confirming bylaw, which we'll get to later. No unfinished business. Any notices of motion? Seeing none. The confirming bylaw being bylaw number 2023-10, being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the meeting held February 21st, 2023, be read a first, second, third time. Signed by the mayor and the clerk and the corporate seal attached thereto. Moved by Deputy Mayor Huntley and Councillor Byrne. All in favor? Confirming bylaw is approved. Motion to adjourn. Councillor Natchoff and Councillor Edgerton, all in favor? That is approved. There's a number of upcoming meetings and events. I'll list them off here. The Cavan Monaghan Public Library Board meeting is this evening at 7 p.m. at the Millbrook branch. The Millbrook Valley Trails Advisory Committee meeting is Monday, February 27th, 2023 at 4 p.m. at the municipal office. The next regular council meeting is Monday, March 6th at 1 p.m. The Municipal Revitalization and Heritage Advisory Committee meeting will be Thursday, March 16th at 2023 at 9 a.m. And then our next, after that, regular council meeting will be Monday, March 20th of 2023 at 1 p.m. And then lastly, the next BIA meeting is Thursday, March 2nd, 2023 at 8 a.m. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today. Have a safe and happy